Hello and welcome back to the Astutis YouTube channel. I'm Brenig Moore, the Technical Director here at Astutis, and today we're going to be talking about fire risk assessment. So what is a fire risk assessment? It's a systematic analysis of the workplace and the work activities so that we can identify anything going on that presents a fire hazard. And a fire hazard is something that has the potential to cause a fire. Once we've done that, we need to evaluate the risk. We need to work out how serious that fire could be in terms of risk to human life and our property and other assets. In the UK, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order places the duty on a responsible person. So who then is a responsible person? Well, in the world of work, in the first instance, that's going to be the employer. Sometimes it might also be the owner of the building or some other party with a significant interest in the building. So in most low to normal risk workplaces, there shouldn't really be any reason why the responsible person, the employer, can't undertake their own fire risk assessment. In more complex workplaces or with more complex work activities where the fire risk is higher, then competence is critical. Competence is very important, and it might become more important to find a suitably qualified, experienced, competent person. So step one is about identifying fire hazards, the things that can cause a fire within the workplace. Now, generally, when we're talking about fire risk assessment, we talk about the fire triangle, and we talk about the need for the three sides of this triangle to be present for a fire to start. We need a fuel, a combustible material, something that's going to burn. Or we need an ignition source, something with enough heat energy to actually ignite that fuel. And we need oxygen, which again, in most workplaces is around us, in atmospheric air, so we don't need to worry about it too much. In some higher risk workplaces, there may be additional sources of oxygen. There may be medical or industrial gases. There may be other chemicals that add additional risk. But generally, basic fire risk assessment, low to normal risk environment, we are thinking about what fuel types have we got, what is there within our business that will burn, and what potential ignition sources have we got, and how are they going to come together. So with fuel sources, combustible materials, things that will burn, it's probably easier to think about what is there in the workplace that's not going to burn. Your furniture will burn, your soft furnishings will burn, your stationery will burn. So there's plenty, even in low to normal risk environments, that is combustible and will burn. We also need to think about higher risk materials. We need to think about materials that are flammable, will burn easily, or highly or extremely flammable. We also need to think about explosives, and we also need to think about oxidizers, that additional oxygen supply we mentioned earlier. So as part of our fire risk assessment, we'll need to do a little structured survey of the workplace to identify all of the things within the workplace that can burn, and to identify any of these higher risk physical chemical hazards, the explosives, the oxidizers, the highly and extremely flammables, and so on. Once we've got that inventory, we need to think about how they might catch fire. What could possibly ignite them? So what are the ignition sources in the workplace? So we've got electrical equipment that could become faulty and could spark or could overheat in some way. More recently, things like lithium-ion battery charging has become quite a hot topic. So step 2 of our fire risk assessment is all about people at risk. So we need to think about our colleagues, and we also need to think about visitors, members of the public, contractors, and anybody else who might be affected. 2 things to think about: total numbers of people affected. Now, if we work in an environment where there are hundreds of people milling about, that's going to be quite different in terms of managing a safe and effective evacuation. So we need to think about numbers affected. And then we also need to think about whether we have any vulnerable individuals or vulnerable groups within our population. So we need to think about children, young people, disabled colleagues, elderly people who may have impaired vision, impaired mobility, impaired hearing. Understanding the people affected and understanding their specific needs is going to be quite important when it comes to developing personal emergency evacuation plans, which we'll touch on later. So step 3 of our fire risk assessment is evaluate and act. So we need to think about the variables affecting the likelihood and severity of a fire, should it occur. We need to think about the arrangements we've got in place for detecting a fire, raising the alarm, and safely evacuating the premises. And if there are any shortfalls in any of our arrangements, we need to act to address them. Okay, so where do we start? So I mentioned the fire triangle earlier. The counter logic from needing the 3 sides of the triangle to come together for a fire to start is that if we can keep the sides of the fire triangle apart, you don't have a fire. And that's the basis of fire prevention strategies. And when it comes to fire prevention strategies in the workplace, it's all about controlling our potential ignition sources and controlling our potential fuel sources and trying to make sure that they are kept apart. Now, with the best will in the world, our fire prevention strategies could fail and we could still find ourselves having a fire in the workplace. In those circumstances, we need to make sure that our fire protection strategies are in place and are going to cope. First thing to think about is how are we going to detect the early signs of a fire? Are we going to rely on individuals, or do we use technology? Do we use smoke detectors or flame detectors and so on? And upon detecting the early signs of that fire, how do we raise the alarm? Is it all part of an automated system, or are we relying on somebody to manually ring a bell? Fighting the fire. So whilst our people are evacuating, there may be a need for some emergency first aid firefighting. We'll have decisions to make in terms of whether we train people to do that, or whether we just expect everybody to turn their back on a fire, safely evacuate, and leave the firefighting to the emergency services, to the professionals. We need to give some thought to portable fire extinguisher provision and training of people in the use of that, or possibly in more sophisticated workplace, fixed fire extinguishers, things like sprinklers and so on. Have we identified safe escape routes? Do we maintain them in good condition and free of obstructions? Are they properly signposted with emergency signage? Do we have emergency lighting in place should that be necessary, as we get into the winter? And where are our people going to assemble once they've followed the evacuation routes and they've left the building? Where is the safe assembly point? Okay, so as a quick overview, quick recap, we need to think about fire prevention, what we can do to control our ignition sources and combustible materials, Then we need to think about fire protection, what we can do to protect our people, our property, and our other assets. We need to think about how we're going to detect a fire. We need to think about how we're going to raise the alarm, or we need to think about how we're going to fight the fire, and we need to think about safe evacuation. And if we have any problems in any of those areas, we're going to need to improve them to a level that we're happy is going to keep our people safe. So step 4 is record, plan and train. So we've got to have a written record of our fire safety risk assessment, and that's going to be invaluable in terms of communicating with our colleagues to help them to understand what the issues are and to help them understand how they play their part in helping us to keep them safe from the risks of fire. As well as a written record of our fire risk assessment, we're also going to need a written record of all of the actions that we need to implement to make the workplace safe. So that's your fire action plan. That's also going to need to be documented, and that's going to need to be tracked through. The training bit is about drilling people in safe evacuation. So how often do we need to drill our people? How often do we need to practice safe evacuations? That's all going to need to be given some thought. So step 5 of our fire risk assessment is review. As with any risk assessment, it's important that we don't just do the exercise once and park it up and forget about it. There should be a living document. It should help us to manage health and safety in an ongoing way. We do need to be able to recognise and react to change. Now, some of these changes might be planned by us. We might be changing processes, changing activities, changing equipment. If we know we're making these changes, then we should be revisiting our fire risk assessment along the way. Some changes may not be planned. We may stumble across them because of an incident, because of a near miss. But again, it's important that these opportunities to learn are reported, are investigated, and that we do learn, we do revisit our fire risk assessments in those circumstances. Finally, it's always worth having a backstop in your system. It's always worth putting a date in the calendar to pull your risk assessment out and revisit it and give it a new think through. That isn't necessarily reworking it or rewriting anything at all, but periodically pull it out, have a look at it, reevaluate and reassure yourself, is it still fit for purpose? If it is, then great. If it's not, if things have changed and we've missed those changes along the way, this is our safety net. This is our opportunity to sweep up, learn the lessons in a timely manner and tidy them up, and move on in a positive way. So I hope that quick overview of basic fire risk assessment was of interest and some use to you. If you've got any further questions, need any more resources, there's a wealth of information available on the Astutis website. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe.